The letter Tet. We'll start with the modern letter. They say it's a snake. I'll show you the image. It's not necessarily a snake. Shield and sword. Offense and defense. So the modern letter is drawn like this. You have a coiling, like the shield, and then you've got the viper's tooth, like the sword. They say that the letter Tet is the one letter that's not in the Ten Commandments. And so people, I've heard it said, well, the Tet must be the evil letter. If you think, well, a snake is evil, and you can see the image of a snake embedded in a Tet, because it's kind of this thing that coils, so Tet must be evil, I think the whole point is missed. The snake coils in a sense of defense, and it puts it in a position to strike out with its fangs in the offense. There's also a picture when it's talking about the 12 tribes that Dan is a serpent by the path who bites at the horse's heels and makes the rider fall backwards. You can say, oh, well, that's an evil thing. And it's like, wait a second. A snake is camouflaged. Picture who's on this horse. Now, there's this concept from the olden days of, maybe you've heard it, he's on his high horse. Anybody ever heard that phrase about being on your high horse? Well, apparently where that comes from is in the ancient days, in like probably the Middle Ages or the 1700s, any horse that was a certain number of hands high automatically belonged to the king. You couldn't be a peasant and be allowed to have a horse of a certain stature. Anything of any great value belonged to the nobility. And so to say, oh, he's up on his high horse, it's like, oh, here's this guy who thinks so much of himself. Who is this that's riding on the horse, on his high horse, you might say, thinking so much of himself as he's going to lord it over the commoner, the people of Israel, perhaps, the downtrodden, and yet Yahweh has his tactics that are like hidden in the bush, like the snake along the side of the path. And here's this big shot riding on his high horse, thinking of himself so arrogantly and proud, and all it takes is this little snake to just bite at the horse's hoofs and throws that guy right off, and he breaks his neck as he falls. He didn't even see it coming. I believe that when Yahweh says Dan is, or it's actually, I think it was Moses talking about it, is like Dan is like this serpent hidden in the grass who bites at the horse's hoofs, is not to say, well, Dan's the evil tribe like a snake. It might be a matter of Yahweh saying, I've got plans for Dan. I'm going to hide him in the bush. And the enemy, the big shots who are high-handedly against the ways of Yahweh, won't even see it coming when their demise is due. There's different ways to read the scriptures. And if we look at these letters, the other thing about this letter Tet here is that in Paleo, it's a circle with a X. Just happens to be fitting in here. But this shield, some of you may have seen this. I'm working actually at the printer. He didn't get a final version, so this is a rough draft. What is our shield? It's not just a concept, it's a reality. And we'll be discussing this in a couple different scriptures today. Some of you maybe have seen this thing that we had printed up, and I at one point had some of these available for people at the radio station around here. This is actually the Shema. What I did was take certain scriptures, which to us is our defense or our sword, and say, well, how do we think of these things? Are these, you hear people recite the Shema. Shema Israel, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. It's like, what's the big deal? Well, if you were a soldier, your sword and your shield is a very big deal. It's all how you regard what these things are. So to write the Shema on the shield is a way of thinking, what are we thinking when we're saying these words? I actually wrote more than just the words of the Shema here. Basically, so what this says, these were printed in color, and this is, I'm printing up on this bronze thing, but this happens to say, Shema Israel, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. Ve'ahavat et Yahweh Elheka ve'kol lavevka. Does anybody know what I'm saying? And you shall love Yahweh, your Elohim, with all your heart. Uve'kol nafshaka, which is all your nephesh, or all your soul. Uve'kol me'odeka, which is all your it's translated strength, or your effort, you might say. And it's Hey Yod Vav, so it's Heyo Ha-Debarim, which is to say, and have all these words, Ve'Allah, which these words, Asher, Anoki, Mitzvecha, and have all these words which I command you, Hayom, this day, Al Lavevka, upon your heart, Ve Ahavat La Roicha, and you shall love your neighbor, Ka Moka, like yourself. Ani Yahweh, I am Yahweh, Mi Kamoka, who is like you, Nadar Bekadosh, Norad Tahilat Osei Fele. So then in English, and these matters I command you this day shall be upon your heart, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am Yahweh, who is like you, mighty in Kadosh, awesome in praise, doing wonders. How is that our shield? What has that got to do with Tet? Why is Tet the letter that's inside the Het? And then to address the matter, specifically, on this chart, there's 3 blue letters, blue lines, 2 purple, 2 red, and everything else is in single column. So here, Het, Tet, and Yod, I have written in the blue, as if they're all the same concept. So last week we did the Het, which is the fence. The fence itself, if you want in and you can't get in, it's a block, it's an obstacle. But if you're in and you want to get out and you can't get out, the Het is a prison. Well, it actually works both ways. So back at the beginning, at the Aleph, we talked about how there was this plan, and the first letter was a bet, which was like this the concept of bi, which is dualistic. Two, there's this pro and this con. You could read each word and each letter in 2 different ways. This dynamic was set up. So each letter has this binary aspect, and then there's this gimel, this action that was sent to it, and then once you have this dualistic bet concept where there's an action put, you have a dalet, which is like this choice. So if you have, you could either do this or that. So embedded within each one of the letters, which is what we're trying to show by this class, is that if you know the letters that start at the beginning, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, it sets up, you might say Aleph through Vav, Aleph through Zion, the first 7 as a package, sets up the study of the sciences. If you study science, if you study creation, if you see what was made, it's like, okay, here's how things work. Study chemistry and math and physics and botany. Even if you study the more esoteric sciences of philosophy and psychology, there's a certain system of the way that Yahweh put it all together. And you can find those systems, you might say, embedded or established in the first 7 letters. So if somebody says, well, just so long as you rest any one day of the 7, you're getting your rest in and that's good enough. That's not what Yahweh established. He established the seventh day, Shabbat, to rest. So there's something fundamentally ingrained in the universe. He even said, don't just you rest, but every 7 years the land should rest. But then you have this cutting off between the Zion and the Het. The Het is a fence, the Zion is a weapon. So it's kind of like a doubling of the cutting off. The Zion, you might say, well, the Zion's like a weapon, that's a sword. And the Het itself is like this shield or this block. So these pictures are not just each individual letter, but they kind of blend. So each letter, what I've tried to do in this, as we're talking about these, is talk about the letter that came before the particular letter and talk about the letter that came after, because though they're distinct, there's also this blending, this evolving of the concepts and how they work together. And the thing is, there's a very close similarity between the Zion and the Tet that are on both sides of the Het. So you could say, well, if this Tet letter is like this sword and shield, that's a defender on the wall. And we talked about how last week, with the white linen fence and the colors of the embroidery on the one big gate. So the breastplate, the bone breastplate I was wearing, the Indian breastplate, was blue, purple, red with gold. And that was the gate. So that's, you could say, an invitation in, but then you've got the concept of a wall being an exclusion, but then you've got this Tet, which is like the guard on the wall. Well, what's the guard on the wall doing? Trying to keep somebody out, or he's defending the wall, which is to say, you can't just barge in. Well, why can't you just barge in? Interestingly enough, the word in the dictionary, if you look it up, that's spelled Het Tet, or Het Tet Aleph, has to do with sin. There's this concept. Nobody could just walk right into the Mishkan, which is a picture of the Het. If you were in contact with the dead, or if you were unclean, you would have to be cleansed by the ashes of the red heifer outside the fence so you could be allowed in. So there's a picture of the Zion being in the place outside of the fence of the ashes of the red heifer. The red heifer had to die. It was slain. It was put to the weapon. The red heifer was put to the weapon outside the fence so that someone who was unclean could come into the fence. So you could say, well, was the Tet in the position of guarding the fence, or is it the Zion? Well, both, kind of. It's like outside there's this weapon, and inside the Het there's this concept of a weapon, which is to say, if somebody comes in who's not fit, who's not worthy, the guard inside the fence will dispatch them. In fact, we brought up this story that Yeshua gave, a parable about a wealthy man giving a party and inviting all these people in. And then he came across this one guy and he says, friend, you're not dressed in the garb of the party. What are you doing in here? And the guy was like, well, I just, he didn't have much of an explanation. He just somehow found his way sneaking in or walking in. And the guy called for the guards inside and said, grab this man, bind him hand and foot, throw him out into the street, and close the door. This is pretty serious business. And it's like, well, what's to distinguish who is allowed in and who isn't allowed in? Well, the Zion outside the fence, you could say, if you're in contact with the dead, or if you're unclean, if you're not fit, you can't even get in. So as we're discussing here, Yeshua, the Mashiach, the Messiah in the Aleph-Bet, how does he line up with the Zion? Well, he was crucified, put to the stake, put to the weapon outside the fence. And as we discussed last week, if you read in Leviticus chapters 4 and 5, there were all kinds of sacrifices made to cleanse people of unintentional sin. It says repeatedly, if a guy does something and it was not intentional, and all of a sudden it comes to his attention, he goes, oh man, what have I done? He could offer a sacrifice and he was forgiven. Now the story comes to mind of King David. Now King David spots Bathsheba bathing on a roof, and he goes and he figures out a way to say, well, come on, he knew what he was doing. We think he knew what he was doing. It's hard to account for what's in somebody else's mind. But when the time came for, I believe it was Nathan the prophet, to confront David with his sin, suddenly it impacted him. Now, we can't account for what we think somebody else knows darn well what they're doing. But sometimes our minds play tricks on us. Maybe somehow David thought that he was still okay. But when he was suddenly convicted of what he did, he repented. And there was forgiveness for him. Now, there was still a very serious cost. The cost was, as Yahweh had made clear to him, the sword will not leave your family. And for the rest of the generations, there was butchery within David's house. You could say, well, David's house didn't last very long. There was, after Solomon, there was Rehoboam, and then everything went bad. But apparently the kings of the Parthians, according to Stephen Collins' research, also were of the lineage of the house of David. I was talking to a fellow the other day at a Persian restaurant, and I said, what's the difference between Parthia and Persia? And he said, it's not Parthia, it's Pars. And all of a sudden I realized, the letter Tav, the last letter, can be pronounced as either a T, a TH, or an S, which is why certain people who speak Hebrew call it Shabbos, not Shabbat. And if they think that anybody calls it Shabbat, they're crazy, they're wrong, they're just bad phonetics. It's Shabbos. It's a dialect difference. It's not that one's right and the other one's wrong, though they'll tell you it is. It's just a dialect difference. So Parthia, as it says in the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament, it was not necessarily known as Parthia, it's Parsia, which is the Persians, which is the Iranians. And I said, well, what's Parthia then? He said, well, that was Parsia. He said, that was a certain dynasty. It's like, oh, well, that makes sense. So here we have inherited a corrupted history. But apparently, again, going back to this other research, a certain dynasty of the rulers of Persia related their lineage of their emperors back to David's lineage. Well, the interesting thing was, we think of certain kingdoms, like the monarchy of Britain, is that, well, the son or the grandson is going to inherit the throne. But apparently with the Parthians, anybody in the family could inherit the throne. So the first thing that happened when someone was crowned emperor is that they'd slaughter their entire family. Aunts, cousins, uncles, anybody related. That sounds like the curse put on David's family, that the sword would not leave your family. So here it is, a different dynasty, a different people, they forgot who they were, and yet they're still doing the same thing. And it was said, I think this might have been Stephen Collins' research, that why did the Magi come to Israel looking for a Messiah? Well, the Magi is a word also where we get the word magician or magic, which comes from the Chaldeans of Assyria, which is the northern part of up near Turkey and Iraq. And what do those guys care about one who would be born as a Messiah of the Jews? Why should they care? Well, apparently because if he was of the lineage of David, he stood to be in line for the emperorship of Parthia, Persia. And so these magi that were coming from the Chaldeans, who were, you might say, the intellectual offspring of Daniel, who was the chief Chaldean. Daniel had the angel, remember, tell him when, 490 years, I believe it was supposed to be, and when you see a sign in the heavens, then, and Daniel had the wealth. He was the wealthiest man. A third of the kingdom had been given unto him under Nebuchadnezzar and also Darius and the Medes and the Persians when they took over the Babylonian kingdom. And he apparently had this wealth that he said, when this individual is born, bring it to him as a gift. And so these wise men from the east, one theory is that they were the descendants of the Chaldean, the Magi, the descendants of Daniel. Of course, if he was a eunuch, they weren't really his descendants. That's why I'm saying that it's considered as intellectual descendants, that they were supposed to bring these gifts offered to the potential emperor of Persia, Yeshua, born in Bethlehem. And the reason why Herod was so upset is because it wasn't just three kings riding in their finery on camels like we see the nativity scene, but these guys probably came with 10,000 soldiers guarding this quite a cache, you might say, of loot that anybody would have wanted to hijack them on the road. And for 10,000 armed soldiers from the arch neighbor enemy of Persia came to Judea, Herod knew that he had potential trouble because the legions of Rome had often fought these Parthians and lost. And it was no small international diplomatic event for these guys to show up. What the point is about this is that we have different history that we've inherited and that we have nice pictures of. But Yahweh has consequences inside his kingdom that look like the sword and the shield, that look like violence, as well as on the outside. Now, we had talked about on the letter Vav, one of the things it meant was, your own ways are pinned to you. And as I mentioned last week, that the Romans had this technique of chaining a dead corpse to your own body in prison. And you couldn't get this guy off, and he sat there and he rotted and he decayed, and the rats are chewing on him and probably chewing on you too, and it was a form of torture. How do we get off this dead corpse that we've kind of inherited regarding our culture, our religious beliefs, doctrines, theologies? How do we get rid of this guy that we've been chained to? Start doing what he said to do, which is represented by the chet. It's not like, okay, we got to go find something to cut those chains. I believe, based on the scriptures that I found, if we simply start doing what Yahweh said, the chains are cut by doing what he said. But once we come into the fence, there's another set of weapons in front of our face, the shield and the spear, or the shield and the sword. The weapon isn't a sword in particular, it's just this concept of the fangs of the serpent, as it were. You could say, well, Adam and Eve, they were inside the garden. What a beautiful place. It was paradise. And yet, something bit them. What was it? Their own transgression. Now, we have the story of the snake in the tree. There was no snake in the tree. There was a serpent, it says, in the Nachash, but yet the pictures we've inherited, again, apparently back in the days of the Middle Ages when people couldn't read, the clergy, the clerics, the clerks, it literally means those who are in charge of the writings and dispensing the information filtered by the powers that be to see to it that certain ideas got across as they chose them to be. In fact, from what I understand, when King James was having his translation made, he instructed his people to make sure that whatever it was they translated should not upset the system. So whatever the translation was, though it was authorized, it was authorized by King James, whatever that translation was should maintain the ecclesiastical order, the regard of the nobility, the regard of the aristocrats. They have these pictures of, okay, there's a snake in the tree, and Adam and Eve were naked, and the serpent was talking to them, and they did this and that. But if you read the story in Hebrew, it reads a little differently. We're not going to get into that story right now, but what I'm saying is what bit them in the garden was their own behavior disobeying the instructions. That's what bit them. Now you could say, well, they were enticed or seduced by this serpent. fine, but it was their behavior contradicting the instructions, which actually, you might say, was this viper's fang into their own, their longevity in the garden. Everything changed. Everything went sour when they disobeyed the instruction. So, the other interesting thing about this letter Tet, in Paleo, it's written as a circle with an X in it. Another way to read it, which is actually written on the chart here, is parentheses with an X. I believe that's one copy that I saw written in the Leviticus scroll from the Qumran caves that they found. And you could say, well, now why? What's the difference? If you're a scribe and you've got a archaic sort of pen, or if you're carving into a piece of wood, it's going to be pretty difficult actually to get a nice circle with a nice neat little X in it. So you're going to find some easier way to draw it. And that's one way right there. There's another way here that they show it, which is like that. Because, see, the other picture is not just a shield and a sword, but it's a basket, a full basket. So here you have this concept in the Zion that it's actually a tree full of ripe fruit. A fruit tree having come to the pinnacle of its form. So 7 is like this perfect number. So if you have in late fall, you see a citrus tree full of lemons, or an apple tree full of these beautiful, delicious looking apples, the picture of that tree at the peak of its intentional design, which is to say provide food, at the end of summer, that's a picture of the Zion. Well, the next thing that happens is the weapon is put to the tree. The hand grabs the fruit and plucks it off. Or the bees come and eat the fruit that isn't plucked off. But nevertheless, the tree reaches the pinnacle, the climax of its circuit, and then it goes into autumn and into winter. Deciduous trees lose their leaves and they look bare again. So you might say that the pinnacle of their season before they deplete is a picture of that number 7, the Zion. Well, a basket of harvested fruit is the Tet, which is the 9. Well, what's in between? Well, if you have a Zion, and then you've got a break, which is this Chet, and then you've got this basket of fruit, the Tet, you could say, well, let's see, the tree in its full form is here, and then you've got the basket of collected fruit there. What happened in between? Something was harvested. The act of the harvesting is what's between the Zion and the Tet. What's the Het? Well, the Het's a fence. But the fence is the kingdom of Yahweh, represented by the big white fence of the Mishkan, as it were. It's the concept of turning away from what's outside. And remember, the letter Het is the H, also drawn in Paleo. It's sometimes like that, which is the number 8, which is the symbol for infinity, the infinite symbol in mathematics. And you could say, if there's perhaps 7,000 years worth of life on the face of the earth, 8 represents the infinite realm after the decreed time for the face of the earth. Whether or not there's 7,000 years, as we discussed last week, Francis Schaeffer, who was back in the 60s regarded as a fundamental Christian's most brilliant scholar, wise genius, he said, there's at least 15,000 years. This notion that there's only 6 or 7 for mankind's life on the earth is just crazy talk. So who knows? But there's a model of 7 days of the week. There's nobody that can really pin it down to say how many years do we actually get, though I've heard people argue quite adamantly that there's going to be exactly to the day 6,000 and then a rapture event, or then Yeshua's going to come back, or this or that. And it's like, listen, we're really not told that, but we're given pictures as models. We're given a 7-day week. So people say, okay, there's 7,000 years, but gee, we've only done 6,000. Does that mean we've got 1,000 years to go? Well, some people say, oh, well, the 7,000th year, is the messianic reign, in which case we go to heaven for 1,000 years. Or maybe he comes back here for 1,000 years. Again, there's no particular model given, but there's this concept that there's a complete form of 7 for man's days on the face of the earth. Whether or not the Messiah is here, that's another matter of doctrinal debate. But 7, a picture of 7, the Zion, the 7-day week, that's what was given for studying the science of the creation of the world. This letter Chet, if it represents this breaking and this stuff on the other side of the fence, that's the kingdom of Yahweh. That has nothing to do with the model of what's outside. So if Yeshua said, behold, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. If he was saying, I am offering you the chance to come into the kingdom and experience the life of the heavenly realm while you're on the face of the earth? Or was he offering us the chance to see a glimpse of what was going to be later? Again, it's subject to interpretation. But the point is here is to say that if we go from the form of the earth, even in its best form, through the Chet, into the realm of Yod-He Vav-He, and into his full basket, we become the harvested fruit of the earth. If the earth is given the 7,000 years, and the earth in its fullness produces the fruit of people, you might say, which is the point of why Project Earth even exists, then to become his harvested fruit is the objective, to end up in his basket. And the fruit which is not harvested ends up getting eaten by the wild animals, or the chickens, or the bees end up eating the fruit. It doesn't go to waste. It's going to serve a purpose. But the question is, this is all a model of what is Yeshua saying about himself, what is he telling us about the kingdom, and what kind of message is to us regarding this. And if you say, okay, the message of the relationship between Zion, Chet, and Tet is that because of sin, I can't get in, but because of the provision of the Zion, of the red heifer sacrifice, or the other sacrifices for unintentional sin, or because of Yeshua, perhaps the one sacrifice for intentional sin was given to us so that we can get in. The objective is to get in, to get past that Chet, and to enter into the kingdom. And then the question is, well, now what? Is that it? Is that salvation? Is that going to heaven when you die? Is that a picture there? Or is there more to the story? Is that just simply where it begins? Remember, the letter 8 as an infinity symbol also means new beginning. 8 is generally regarded as a new beginning. And as Jamie mentioned, the letter 9 is generally regarded as a fullness. Well, where do they come up with the idea of fullness? From the image of the full basket, which goes all the way back to before the Greek language even came about. Because remember, this is what's regarded as Phoenician or ancient Hebrew, which was before the Greek language even developed. And out of Greek came Latin and all the modern European and American language. But remember, this is of an ancient consideration. There's this picture that somehow there's going to be this harvest of the earth into the infinity, the infinite time of a different realm, a different kingdom, that you want to make sure you become that harvested fruit. But if you do so, there's certain terms. And the terms are just as dire inside, the sword and the shield, as they are on the outside, the sword, the weapon, the axe, the moat, the crucifixion, the red heifer being slaughtered. These images outside, there's also these images inside. And it's like, well, why? Because to end up in Yahweh's basket, surrounded by him, that's a dangerous position as well. So it talks about, I believe it's in Jeremiah, I believe it's where it is, it says, when the people are willing to swear Chai Yahweh, which is translated, as Yahweh lives, then things will turn around. But what that means is, if you say, oh, I can say that, sure, Yahweh lives. And Yahweh even says, they say that, but they're lying. And because they're lying, what you're doing by saying, as Yahweh lives, you're invoking Yahweh's scrutiny of judgment by your own volition. You're calling it down upon your own head, where nothing is tolerated by him, which is of a lie, of some form of inequity, of some kind of untruth. Remember, Yeshua said there's nobody who, I forget where whether it's in Revelation or another place, actually, I forget where in the scriptures, but it says, nobody who makes and crafts untruth or a lie or some kind of falsehood has any part in my kingdom. Now, we mentioned once before that the reason why people that are regarding the Hebraic roots make such a big deal about the Sabbath day and the festivals, it's like, come on, what's the big deal? What day you want to rest? It's a matter of truth. If we perpetuate the notion that there's nothing wrong with saying that Sunday is the sacred holy day, or that Christmas and Easter are the days that he told us to regard his kingdom, it's simply not true. I just got a letter from a place called ACD, or Association for Christian Development, I believe it's called, or something. And there's a whole article about saying it's clearly evident. I was in my friend's office the other day, an insurance guy, and there's another article saying how Christmas and Easter came from the pagan amalgamism, you might say, the blending. Michael Rood talked about that. Jim Staley talks about that. The guy who wrote The Two Babylons, or Come Out of Her, My People, Lou White. This information is very clear. Christmas, Easter, and Sunday are contrivances of the church, where the Catholic system, under Constantine, Catholic means universal, they blended it together with different pagan religions. And they came up with something that would fit everybody, and they did it when they came over to the New World here. The point is, this is common knowledge, but it's not true to say that these are Yahweh's ways. So for us to say, if we come to Yahweh and come to the terms of his covenant, we are trying to seek and determine the pure truth to his glory. The word is kavod, which is weight, but it's also his esteem, which is that which rises up. So you could say there's this play on this word kavod also. That gets into another verse we'll get to in the next session. The point is, the tav, which is an X shape, the last letter, is in the basket. When you come into his kingdom, you get the full basket of the covenant. And if you look back at the book of Exodus, and if you even look back at Genesis, where he talked to Adam and Eve in the garden, the covenant included with it the blessing and the curse. The full basket of the blessing is you do what he says and we get the blessing. The full basket of the curse is you claim to be his, he teaches you his ways, and if you disobey his ways, you get the full measure of the curse. Leviticus 26, as we said before, Yahweh says 4 different times, he says, I will present to you, Israel, my covenant. And because you are my chosen people, I chose you out of all the people on the face of the earth. Because I've chosen you, I'm going to use you to display to all the peoples of the earth the terms. If you do my covenant, I will restore the blessings to you, and you will get the blessing. But if you don't, I will multiply 7 times like your sins, or 7 ways. The word is shin bet ayin, shavah, which is 7, and it doesn't mean 7 times or 7 ways. It's the concept of multiplying by 7, because the word 7, shavah, is the word for oath, or curse, or 7, which is full and plenty and satisfied and complete and abundant. It's like, wait a minute, that sounds like the tet. Again, I'm trying to show you that the word for 7, the Zion, and the word for 9, which is the tet, both have the pictures of fully. Why is that? It's because the relationship, because of our sins and our waywardness, we were fully excluded. There's the wall, the het. We're fully excluded from the kingdom unless we're fully atoned for by the sacrifice that was provided for us. And when we come in, it's not to say, I got away with that, and now I can do anything I want. No, it's because now we're fully obligated to keep the terms of the covenant, which is why we had to make a decision, will you come in or not? And so at the Mount Sinai, Israel was given the option. Will we regard his words? And do you remember what all the people said? All that you have said we will hear and we will do. That was the sworn commitment. That was the oath of the covenant that the people of Israel had agreed to back at Mount Sinai. So these words will come back also in the book of Hosea, which we'll get to in the next session here. It all goes back to the sworn oath. So if somebody says, I just want to go to heaven, it's like, why? What do you expect to find in heaven? You'll find the ways of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. If you don't want his ways now, you certainly don't want to be stuck with his ways for eternity. You don't want to go to heaven. If you don't want to regard the covenant of Yahweh with his people now, you really don't want to even go to heaven. So why do you think that when you go to heaven, or that when you come to the new covenant now, like there's a new fence, that suddenly the covenant's been done away with? Suddenly there's no more terms. Where do we ever come up with the notion that there's a new covenant with new terms, new stipulations, new requirements, new privileges? Where did we come up with that? Oh, it's in the New Testament. Or so we've been told. Did Paul come up with that? Paul said, follow me like I follow the Messiah. Well, who is the Messiah? Oh, Yeshua the Messiah. If he crossed and disobeyed a single word of the Torah, he wouldn't have been the Messiah, because he would have sinned. And yet we're told that he didn't sin, which means he kept every single word and every single letter of this covenant, of these words. Everything he did. And he said, follow me. And so if Shaul, who knew the Torah better than anybody, studied probably more than any other person on the face of the earth at the time, and he thought that this one that was crucified was a renegade, rebel, liar, worthy of death, and all of a sudden, because of his experience, he realized he had this vision, and he went back and he spent, what was it, 14 years studying? And he realized, I was wrong. This guy is the one we were hoping to see. This is the promised Mashiach sent to us to show us how to walk in the ways of the covenant. And now Paul thought, I will do everything I can to walk in these ways, which is what he was trying to do before, actually, when he went about killing, murdering, incarcerating those who were following the Messiah. And Paul said, I'm the chief of sinners. I've done so much wrong. These ones that were following Yeshua as the Mashiach, walking in the ways of the Torah, were doing what we're supposed to do. Why was he killing them? Because of his misunderstanding. So when he went back and he re-looked at it and thought, these guys are doing what I've been trying to get people to do my whole life. Do the words of the Torah. That's what we're all supposed to be doing. So Paul said, follow me as I follow him. Watch me. I'm going to do everything I can to follow the words of this Torah. But yet, Paul has been given a bad rap through the last 2,000 years where we say Paul gave us a new religion. Paul did away with the Torah. Paul changed things. Oh, there's a new covenant. Oh, yeah? Really? Is there? How could there be a new way? Where does Paul get off with the authority to give us a new covenant? Oh, well, he must have been given a vision. Well, let's go back to Deuteronomy. It says if somebody has a dream or a vision, a prophecy, and it comes true, if it comes true, it must be of Yahweh. And if he tries to lead you astray to some other words other than the words we were given on Mount Sinai. It's a trick. It's a trick from the devil. No, it's a trick from Yahweh. See, the word devil isn't the word used in Scripture. The word used in Scripture is Satan. Yeah, that's Satan, the devil. No. The word Shaitan in Hebrew means adversary. Yahweh himself presents himself as an adversary to his people to see if he can trick them into turning away from his very words. Now, wait a minute. Which stained glass window shows this picture? It's not there. I don't remember ever hearing that. Well, why would Yahweh do such a thing? You'd think he'd be so happy to finally get somebody inside his side of a fence that he'd do everything he could to coddle them and to be nice to them and to make everything real comfortable and give them everything their heart desires. That's not the way it works. It'd be nice if it did. I think it would be nice if it did, but that's not the way it works. Read the book. Read Job. The stories don't line up with some of the stuff we've been told or led to believe. And so the question is, what's the truth? If Yahweh's going to bring us into the kingdom at great expense, remember it cost him the expense of Yeshua's getting his own flesh ripped to shreds like the image of that ghillie suit that we wore at the week of the Vav there, right? His own humanity was ripped to shreds as a picture of the fact that we, though maybe well-intentioned, have ripped to shreds the Torah, thinking it to be common, profane, vile, of no regard, which is the word het lamed lamed, halal, Ezekiel 36:23. We mentioned this before. Yahweh says, I will make my name kadosh when you make my name kadosh, which you have made halal in the eyes of all the nations amongst whom you have been dispersed. We need to make his name kadosh, which is what this class is about. Look at what is kadosh? His stuff, not our stuff, his stuff. How do we make it kadosh? Learn what these letters mean, proclaim what they mean, regard them as being all a picture of the Yeshua, the true Mashiach, the true sent one, to show us the ways how to walk in his ways, not telling a story about, it's been, again, the word halal, het lamed lamed, where I think we get the word hell, which is the 8th letter, H, het, LL, HLL, hell. It means punched holes into, rendered vile, profane, common, drained out. Look it up in the dictionary. But instead, what we get when we enter the kingdom of Yud-He Vav-He, the het, is another 2 words here I'll show you right before the break here. The word, you know about the Kingdom of Oz? Hollywood has played up the Kingdom of Oz. Now some people think, Hollywood, that's just profane nonsense. We shouldn't go there. The Emerald City, after all. Well, remember, in the book of Revelation, John said he saw, as it were, an emerald rainbow above the throne. Well, what does that mean? It could mean like a gem shining like a gem, but it might mean like a green rainbow, which is why it's on this little emblem that we talked about another week it's on the chart, and we have the picture back there. But picture this emerald city. And think of the city of Oz. And it's like, that's Hollywood. Well, in Hebrew, the word is spelled Ayin Zion. And it means, it's pronounced Oz, and it means glory, splendor, might, bold, dynamic, acrid, sharp, pungent, just blazing color. That's the word Oz. And if you read it, this is an eyeball, that means understand or see or consider and weigh and measure, and you better evaluate what? The Zion. And remember, the letter Zion, as in Zion Hey or Zion Aleph Tav, means this. Out of all of history, there was one famous guy, one Vav man, who was Zioned outside the Het of Jerusalem, supposedly to pay the price of the sins of the people of the world so they could enter the Het. Now, whether or not you debate that subject, whether or not your favorite rabbi has ever told you this story, or whether or not you think it's another Christian trick, a lie, that they are trying to get us to profane the Torah, the truth of the matter, I believe, is that if we understand the Vav Man Zion outside the Chet, we'll realize what glorious splendor Yahweh provided to give us a way to get back into the Chet. And the word Chet with the letter Yod is the word that's translated alive or life or living or lively. But it also can be said is, why is it spelled Chet Yod? The letter Yod as a suffix basically means my. And the Chet, remember, is a fence, a container, like a treasure box. And yet Yod is the first letter of Yod He Vav He, meaning the creator. And so you put all these concepts together, and what it's basically saying, I believe, is Yahweh saying, my kingdom concerns life. Anything alive is my business. My treasure is to command life. I claim the authority to invent life, to cause life. There's a psalm that says, Yahweh commands the blessing. Chaim et ha'olam. It's the last phrase of the song, of the Aleph-Bet song, and it means live forever. Chaim is the plural, right? So it's Chet Yod with a Yod Mem, which you might say is plural, but it also means the greatest form of, the highest life. Ed Ha'olam is Ayin Dalet, which is where we get the word like forever and ever. This is the witness, meaning like and ever, and Olam is Ayin Vav Lamed Mem. Chaim et Ha'olam, live forever. You see, whether or not there's death, whether or not things die, whether or not things are subject to the weapon, Yahweh can resurrect anything he wants. And so you get the book of Ezekiel 30, chapter 37, where he shows Ezekiel a valley of dead, dry bones, and he says, hey, Ezekiel, you think these bones can live? And he says, you know, you're Yahweh. You can make anything live. You can make dry bones live. Sure, why not? You see, Yahweh says, my kingdom is the kingdom of life. If you come in here, it lives. And then you go back to the Garden of Eden, and he says, why did he kick them out of the garden? And he says, lest they turn and put their hand back to the tree of life and eat of it. And it's like, and what? Live with death forever? There's something going on where Yahweh says, if I cause you to live, it must be pure life. Nothing of death can come in. So the guard of the Tet inside the Het is to make sure that nothing of death has infiltrated into the kingdom. And if we drag the stuff from outside, inside, it will be put to the sword. You do not want to say, oh, as Yahweh lives, Yahweh Chai, and be caught guilty of breaking the Torah, which is his pure life. You will be bringing down terrible things upon your own head. The point of this is to say we do not have a carte blanche prerogative to think because we were saved outside by the blood of the sent one, we can come in and profane and defile the pure things of the Torah and think we can get away with it because it just doesn't matter anymore. The sword inside, I think, is a picture of telling us this is very serious matters. And the form of the covenant, the tav, inside the full basket, inside the fence, is to say, we've got the full curse and the full blessing staring us at the face, that we were once alienated from it outside in the darkness, but now that we're inside, it's lit, it's in our face, and we better regard it, and that's what the next set of letters is all about. After the break, we'll get to see that.